My name is Marcus, and 3 months ago I watched my ex-girlfriend Sarah walk down the aisle in a designer wedding dress that cost more than my annual salary. She was marrying my cousin Trevor, the golden boy of our family who inherited a tech empire worth $40 million. I thought watching the woman I loved marry my own blood would be the most painful moment of my life. But as I sat in that mahogany-paneled church, adjusting my cheap rental tux, while Trevor's groomsmen flashed their Rolexes, I had no idea that the real betrayal was just beginning. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What I discovered 3 weeks later would destroy not just their perfect marriage, but Trevor's entire fortune. And the secret I'm about to share with you? It's going to change everything you think you know about family, loyalty, and revenge. I should probably start from the beginning, back when Sarah and I were still together, and Trevor was just my annoying rich cousin who showed up to family gatherings in his Tesla. I'm a mechanic in Portland, Oregon, nothing glamorous about it. I work with my hands, come home with grease under my fingernails, and my idea of a fancy dinner is taking Sarah to the Olive Garden on her birthday. Sarah never seemed to mind. She worked as a dental hygienist, drove a 10-year-old Honda Civic, and we'd spend our weekends hiking Mount Hood or watching Netflix in my small apartment above the auto shop. We'd been together for 2 years, and honestly, I was planning to propose. I'd been saving up for months, putting aside every extra dollar I could scrape together for a ring. Nothing extravagant, but something real, something that meant something. Sarah used to joke that she didn't need diamonds, that she'd be happy with a ring from a vending machine as long as it came from me. I believed her. Maybe that was my first mistake. Trevor entered our lives like a hurricane in an expensive suit. He'd just moved back to Portland after his father died, leaving him the family business. Tech Solutions Northwest wasn't just successful, it was the kind of company that had contracts with half the Fortune 500. Trevor was 32, same as me, but where I had call-used hands and a 5-year-old pickup truck, he had manicured nails and a collection of sports cars that he rotated like most people change their socks. The first time Sarah met Trevor was at my grandmother's 80th birthday party. I remember because she spent 20 minutes getting ready, which was unusual for her. She picked out this blue sundress that brought out her eyes, and when I complimented her, she laughed and said she wanted to look nice for family photos. I didn't think anything of it at the time. Trevor arrived fashionably late, as always, wearing what I later learned was a custom-tailored suit that probably cost more than my rent for 3 months. He brought Grandma an enormous bouquet of white orchids and a check for $5,000, which he presented with that trademark smile that made every aunt in the room swoon. Sarah and I were sitting at the kids' table, even though we were both grown adults, because that's where the poor relatives always ended up at our family gatherings. Trevor made his rounds, shaking hands with uncles, kissing cheeks, and dropping casual mentions of his latest business acquisition or his recent trip to Dubai. When he finally made it to our table, I stood up to introduce him to Sarah. The moment their hands touched, something shifted in the air. It was subtle, but I felt it. The way her eyes lingered on his face, just a beat too long. The way his smile became more genuine when he looked at her. They talked for maybe 10 minutes about nothing important. Trevor mentioned he was looking for a good dentist in the area, and Sarah laughed and said she'd be happy to recommend her office. Normal conversation, the kind you have with your boyfriend's cousin at a family party. But there was an electricity there that I tried to ignore, tried to write off as paranoia or insecurity. After that night, Sarah started asking more questions about Trevor. Casual questions, the kind that seemed innocent enough. What kind of business did he run exactly? How did he get so successful so young? Did he have a girlfriend? I answered them all without thinking. Proud even, because despite my complicated feelings about Trevor's wealth and success, he was still family. I told her about how his father had started the company from nothing, how Trevor had gone to Stanford on a full scholarship, how he doubled the company's value in just 5 years. I didn't notice at first how often Sarah's phone started buzzing. She'd always been active on social media, but suddenly she was constantly checking Instagram, scrolling through Facebook, typing quick messages that she'd minimize whenever I walked by. When I asked who she was texting, she'd say it was her sister or a coworker, always with that same bright smile that I was starting to recognize as her deflection face. The changes started small. Sarah began staying late at work more often, always with explanations that sounded reasonable: a difficult patient who needed extra attention, inventory that needed to be reorganized, training sessions for new equipment. She'd come home tired and distracted, claiming she was too exhausted to talk about her day. Our weekend hikes became less frequent. She was always too busy, too stressed, too something. 3 weeks after Grandma's party, Sarah suggested we go to a wine tasting downtown. She'd never shown much interest in wine before, but I figured she was trying something new, maybe looking for ways we could spend more quality time together. The vineyard was upscale, the kind of place where a single glass cost more than a 6-pack of beer. I felt out of place in my khakis and button-down shirt, surrounded by people in designer clothes, discussing tannins and vintage years like they were speaking a foreign language. That's when I saw Trevor. He was standing near the tasting bar, chatting with the sommelier like they were old friends. He wore a charcoal gray sweater that probably cost more than my weekly paycheck, and he held his wine glass with the kind of casual confidence that money breeds. Our eyes met across the room, and he raised his glass in a friendly wave. Sarah grabbed my arm. "What a coincidence," she said, but her voice had a forced quality that made my stomach tighten. "We should go say hello." As we approached, Trevor's face lit up with what seemed like genuine pleasure. "Marcus, Sarah, what a pleasant surprise. I was just telling Roberto here about this fantastic Pinot Noir from a small vineyard in Willamette Valley. You have to try it." He ordered a bottle for our table, insisting it was his treat. The wine was incredible, I had to admit, with layers of flavor that I'd never experienced before. Trevor regaled us with stories about his recent business trip to Napa Valley, where he'd invested in a boutique winery. Sarah hung on every word, asking thoughtful questions about the wine industry and laughing at Trevor's casual jokes about million-dollar handshake deals. I tried to participate in the conversation, but I felt like an outsider looking in. When Trevor mentioned meeting the owner of a famous restaurant chain, Sarah asked about the food scene in San Francisco. When he talked about his plans to buy a vacation home in Tuscany, she mentioned how she'd always dreamed of traveling to Italy. I sat there sipping wine that cost more per glass than I usually spent on groceries for a week, watching my girlfriend connect with my cousin over a lifestyle I could never provide. The evening ended with Trevor picking up the check, despite my protests. As we said our goodbyes in the parking lot, he mentioned that his company was sponsoring a charity gala the following month. The tickets were $500 each, but he had a few extra if we were interested. I started to decline, knowing we couldn't afford that kind of expense, but Sarah quickly accepted before I could finish speaking. On the drive home, Sarah was more animated than she'd been in weeks. She talked about how sophisticated the wine tasting was, how knowledgeable Trevor seemed about everything from business to travel to art. She wondered aloud what it would be like to have that kind of freedom, to be able to travel anywhere in the world on a whim, to never have to worry about money. I should have paid more attention to the wistfulness in her voice. I should have recognized the signs that she was already slipping away from me. Instead, I chalked it up to a fun evening out and tried to push down the uncomfortable feeling that I was losing something I couldn't quite name. The charity gala was held at the Portland Art Museum, a gleaming venue that had been transformed into something from a fairy tale. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow patterns across marble floors, and servers in black tie uniforms carried trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres that probably cost more than my lunch budget for a month. Sarah had bought a new dress for the occasion, a black cocktail dress that she'd charged to her credit card despite our agreement to discuss major purchases. She looked stunning, and I told her so, but I could see her eyes scanning the room, taking in the wealth and glamour that surrounded us. Trevor found us almost immediately, looking like he'd stepped off the pages of a men's fashion magazine in his perfectly fitted tuxedo. He introduced us to a parade of influential people, whose names I immediately forgot, but whose importance was made clear by Sarah's increasingly animated responses.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
A city councilman who remembered Trevor from his Stanford days. The owner of a restaurant chain who was expanding into the Pacific Northwest. A tech entrepreneur who'd just sold her startup for 8 figures. I watched Sarah transform throughout the evening. She became more poised, more charming, more confident with each introduction. She asked intelligent questions about business strategy and urban development. She laughed at inside jokes about the Portland social scene. She fit in seamlessly with people who lived in a world I'd only seen in movies. Trevor was attentive to both of us, but I couldn't help noticing how often his attention focused on Sarah. He brought her a fresh glass of champagne before she'd finished her previous one. He introduced her to people as my brilliant girlfriend who works in healthcare, making her job sound more impressive than it was. When the auction began, he bid on and won a weekend getaway to a luxury resort in Cannon Beach, then casually mentioned that he probably wouldn't use it and would hate to see it go to waste. The drive home was quiet. Sarah stared out the window at the city lights, lost in thought. When I asked if she'd enjoyed herself, she nodded absently and said it had been incredible. She talked about the art collection, the caliber of people she'd met, the opportunities that seemed to exist in Trevor's world. She didn't mention me at all. That night marked the beginning of the end, though I was too blind or too stubborn to see it. Sarah started working even later, often not coming home until after I'd already gone to bed. When I asked about her day, she'd give vague answers about being busy at the office. Our conversations became shorter, more superficial. She stopped asking about my work, stopped sharing stories about her patients, stopped talking about our future together. I found the first real evidence of their relationship by accident. Sarah had left her laptop open on the kitchen table while she showered, and a notification popped up from Instagram. It was a direct message from Trevor, and even though I only caught a glimpse before the screen went dark, I saw enough to make my blood run cold. "Miss you too," the message read, followed by a heart emoji. I stood there staring at the black screen, my mind racing through possible explanations. Maybe it was innocent, maybe they'd become friends, and I was reading too much into a casual message. Maybe Trevor sent heart emojis to everyone. But deep down, I knew. I knew the way you know when you're falling, or when you've been punched in the stomach. I knew that everything I'd built with Sarah was crumbling around me. I didn't confront her that night. I told myself I needed more evidence, that I couldn't accuse her of something based on a single message. But the truth was, I was terrified of hearing her confirm what I already knew. So I started paying closer attention, looking for signs that I'd been missing. Sarah's phone habits became more secretive. She started taking calls in the other room, claiming they were work-related. She began going out for drinks with coworkers more frequently, always coming home with elaborate stories about office drama that seemed designed to fill time rather than share information. She bought new clothes, expensive pieces that she said were on sale but still cost more than we usually spent on a month of entertainment. The breaking point came 6 weeks after the charity gala. I'd planned a surprise weekend getaway to the coast, the same resort where we'd had our first vacation together. I'd saved up for months, booked a room with an ocean view, made dinner reservations at the restaurant where we'd shared our first "I love you." When I presented her with the confirmation email, expecting excitement or at least appreciation for the thought, Sarah's face fell. She couldn't go, she said. She'd already made plans to visit her sister in Seattle. It was a last-minute thing, but her sister was going through a tough time and needed support. The explanation was reasonable, delivered with just the right amount of regret and apologetic smiles, but I knew she was lying. I could see it in the way she wouldn't meet my eyes, the way her hands fidgeted with her phone, the way she immediately launched into unnecessary details about her sister's fictional problems. That night, after Sarah had gone to bed, claiming exhaustion from her long day at work, I did something I'd never done before. I went through her phone. I'm not proud of it, and under normal circumstances, I would never violate someone's privacy like that. But I was drowning in suspicion and uncertainty, and I needed to know the truth. What I found was worse than I'd imagined. Hundreds of text messages between Sarah and Trevor, dating back to the week after Grandma's birthday party. The early messages were innocent enough, but they quickly evolved into something more intimate. Plans to meet for coffee when I was at work. Shared jokes about inside references I didn't understand, compliments about how beautiful she looked, or how smart she was. By the time I reached the most recent messages, the content had become explicitly romantic. Trevor telling Sarah how much he'd missed her during his business trip to San Francisco. Sarah responding that she'd been counting the days until he returned. Trevor suggesting they spend the weekend at his cabin in Mount Hood, the same area where Sarah and I used to hike together. Sarah agreeing enthusiastically, saying she'd tell me she was visiting her sister. I sat on the bathroom floor at 3 in the morning, reading through months of betrayal in the cold blue light of Sarah's phone screen. Every sweet message, every shared secret, every plan they'd made behind my back felt like a physical blow. But what hurt most wasn't just the affair itself. It was seeing how Sarah came alive in those messages, how she was more witty and confident and passionate in her texts with Trevor than she'd been with me in months. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed next to Sarah, listening to her breathe, watching her peaceful face in the darkness, and trying to figure out what to do next. Part of me wanted to wake her up and demand an explanation. Part of me wanted to confront Trevor and settle things the way men used to settle things. But a larger part of me was simply heartbroken, mourning the loss of the relationship I'd thought we had. When Sarah left for work the next morning, kissing me goodbye with the same casual affection she'd shown for months, I called in sick to the shop and spent the day walking around the city, trying to clear my head. I ended up at Powell's Books, wandering the aisles without really seeing the titles, just needing to be around other people without having to interact with them. That's where I made my decision. I wasn't going to confront Sarah about the affair. I wasn't going to beg her to stay or try to compete with Trevor's money and lifestyle. I was going to let her go, because holding on to someone who didn't want to be held was just another form of betrayal. But I was also going to protect myself. I was going to end things on my terms, with whatever dignity I could salvage. I waited until the weekend, when we were both home and had time to talk without the pressure of work schedules. I made coffee the way Sarah liked it, with cream and just a touch of honey, and asked her to sit with me at the kitchen table. She must have sensed something in my tone because her face became guarded, the same expression she wore when she was preparing to lie about her whereabouts. I told her I knew about Trevor. I didn't go into details about how I'd found out, or what specific evidence I'd seen. I just said I knew, and that I wasn't angry, just sad. Sarah's face went through a series of emotions: surprise, guilt, relief, and finally something that looked almost like gratitude. She didn't deny it. She didn't try to explain it away, or minimize what had happened. She just nodded, and said she was sorry. We talked for 2 hours that morning, the most honest conversation we'd had in months. Sarah admitted that she'd been unhappy for a while, feeling trapped in a life that seemed too small for her ambitions. She'd never meant for things with Trevor to go as far as they had, but once they started spending time together, she realized how much she'd been settling for. She loved me, she said, but she wasn't in love with me anymore. Trevor offered her a life she'd only dreamed about, opportunities she'd never have otherwise. I listened without interrupting, letting her explain herself, because I figured she owed us both that much honesty. When she finished, I told her I understood, and I meant it. I couldn't give her the life Trevor could provide, and it wasn't fair to either of us to pretend otherwise. I asked only that she be honest with me from now on, that we end things cleanly without any more deception. Sarah moved out that weekend. She'd been spending most of her time at Trevor's penthouse anyway, so there wasn't much to pack. She left behind the small things that had been ours together, the coffee mug with the chip on the handle that she'd claimed as her own, the paperback novels we'd shared, the framed photo from our trip to Crater Lake. I kept them all, even though looking at them hurt, because they were proof that what we'd had was real, even if it hadn't been enough. I threw myself into work after that, taking on extra hours at the shop and volunteering for the jobs nobody else wanted. Physical labor was a blessing because it kept my hands busy and my mind focused on immediate problems with clear solutions. A transmission that needed rebuilding didn't care about my broken heart. An engine that wouldn't start didn't judge me for not being rich enough to keep my girlfriend. Trevor called me a week after Sarah moved out. His voice was carefully neutral, the tone you'd use to discuss business with someone you didn't know well. He wanted to talk, he said, to clear the air and make sure there were no hard feelings between family members. I agreed to meet him for coffee, curious despite myself about what he had to say. We met at a place downtown that served artisanal coffee in handmade ceramic cups that probably cost more than my usual mug. Trevor was already there when I arrived, wearing jeans and a sweater that managed to look both casual and expensive. He stood up when he saw me, extending his hand for a shake like we were conducting a business meeting. Trevor's apology was polished and sincere, the kind of speech he'd probably practiced in front of a mirror. He was sorry for the way things had happened, he said. He'd never intended to come between Sarah and me. Their relationship had developed naturally, and by the time they realized how serious it was becoming, they were both too invested to step back. He hoped I could understand, and that eventually we could rebuild our family relationship. I listened to his carefully crafted words and nodded in the right places, but what struck me most was how little genuine emotion he showed. This was Trevor managing a potentially uncomfortable situation with the same skill he brought to business negotiations. He wasn't really sorry for what he'd done. He was sorry that it had been messy, that it had created complications he now had to resolve. When he finished his speech, I told him I appreciated his honesty and that I harbored no ill will toward either of them. I was lying, of course. I was hurt and angry and feeling more inadequate than I'd ever felt in my life, but I also recognized that Trevor was offering me a way to handle this situation with grace, and taking that offer was probably my best option for moving forward. Trevor seemed relieved by my response. He relaxed visibly, his smile becoming more genuine. He even asked about the auto shop, showing what appeared to be real interest in my work. We talked for another 20 minutes about neutral topics like sports and weather and family gossip. When we parted ways, he clapped me on the shoulder and said he was glad we could work things out like adults. The months that followed were a strange form of torture. Sarah and Trevor became Portland's newest power couple, appearing at charity events and society gatherings that were covered in the local lifestyle magazines. I'd see their photos sometimes when I was standing in line at the grocery store, Sarah glowing in designer dresses that complemented Trevor's expensive suits. They looked happy together, perfectly matched in a way that Sarah and I had never been. I tried dating again, but it felt hollow and forced. Every woman I met seemed to pale in comparison to Sarah, and I found myself making unfavorable comparisons between their lives and the glamorous world Trevor had introduced Sarah to. I was stuck, emotionally and practically, in a place that felt smaller and more limiting than it had before I'd seen what else was possible. The engagement announcement came 8 months after Sarah had moved out. Trevor proposed at the Portland Art Museum, in the same gallery where we'd attended the charity gala. The ring was enormous, a diamond surrounded by smaller stones that probably cost more than I made in 2 years. The announcement made the society pages, complete with a professional photograph and quotes about their shared commitment to philanthropy and community involvement. I found out about the engagement the same way everyone else did, by reading about it in the newspaper. Sarah hadn't called to tell me, which I understood. What would be the point? We'd agreed to a clean break, and maintaining contact would only make things harder for everyone involved. But seeing their happiness announced so publicly, reading about their plans for a destination wedding, and their dreams of starting a family together, felt like a final door closing on the life I'd thought we were building. The wedding invitation arrived 6 weeks before the ceremony, heavy cardstock with elegant script, requesting the honor of my presence at the marriage of Sarah Elizabeth Morrison and Trevor James Hartwell at St. Mary's Cathedral. I stared at it for a long time, trying to decide if Trevor had sent it as a gesture of reconciliation or as a form of psychological warfare. Either way, I knew I had to go. Not going would be admitting defeat, acknowledging that I was too hurt or too bitter to handle their happiness with maturity. I bought a new suit for the occasion, not because I wanted to impress anyone, but because my only other formal wear was the tuxedo I'd rented for the charity gala, and wearing that felt like a form of self-torture I wasn't ready to inflict on myself. The suit was nothing special, off the rack from a department store, but it fit well enough and made me feel like I could hold my own in whatever social situation awaited me. The morning of the wedding, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror, adjusting my tie and giving myself the same pep talk I'd used before difficult conversations with customers who wanted to argue about repair costs. I could do this. I could watch the woman I'd loved marry my cousin with grace and dignity. I could smile and offer congratulations and prove to everyone, including myself, that I'd moved on. Mary's Cathedral was packed with Portland's social elite, people whose names I recognized from business articles and charity event coverage. I found a seat toward the back, nodding politely to the few relatives I recognized, but avoiding extended conversations. The sanctuary was decorated with white roses and greenery, elegant without being ostentatious, exactly the kind of tasteful display that money could buy. When the processional music began, I felt my chest tighten with an emotion I couldn't quite name. Sarah appeared at the back of the cathedral, radiant in a wedding dress that probably cost more than my car. She moved down the aisle with perfect posture, her smile serene and confident. She looked like a woman who had found exactly what she'd been looking for. Trevor waited at the altar in a custom tuxedo, his face glowing with pride and satisfaction. When Sarah reached him, he took her hands and whispered something that made her laugh, a private moment of joy that felt intimate despite being witnessed by 200 guests. They looked perfect together, like they'd been designed to complement each other. The ceremony was beautiful and traditional, filled with readings about love and commitment, and the joining of two souls in holy matrimony. I listened to their vows, personal promises about supporting each other's dreams and building a life filled with adventure and purpose. Sarah's voice was clear and strong, as she promised to love Trevor for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death parted them. The irony wasn't lost on me. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Trevor lifted Sarah's veil and kissed her with the kind of passion that made some guests sigh with romantic satisfaction. They walked back down the aisle together, hands joined, faces glowing with happiness. I applauded along with everyone else, the sound hollow in my ears. The reception was held at Trevor's Country Club, a sprawling venue with manicured gardens and panoramic views of the Willamette Valley. I made it through the cocktail hour, by focusing on the scenery and avoiding conversations that would require me to express enthusiasm about the happy couple. When dinner was served, I found myself seated at a table with distant relatives and family friends, people who knew enough to be polite, but not enough to ask uncomfortable questions about my relationship with the bride and groom. The speeches began after the main course. Trevor's best man, a college friend who now worked on Wall Street, told amusing stories about their fraternity days and Trevor's legendary ability to turn any situation to his advantage. Sarah's maid of honor, her sister from Seattle, talked about how happy Sarah had been since meeting Trevor, how she'd never seen her sister so fulfilled and excited about the future. When Trevor stood to give his own speech, the room fell silent with anticipation. He was a natural public speaker, comfortable with attention and skilled at commanding a room. He talked about finding Sarah when he least expected it, about recognizing immediately that she was special, about feeling grateful every day for the chance to build a life with someone so intelligent and beautiful and kind. His words were perfectly chosen and delivered with just the right amount of emotion. He thanked the guests for sharing their special day, acknowledged both sets of parents for their love and support, and promised that he and Sarah would honor the trust everyone had placed in their relationship. It was a flawless performance, and the applause was thunderous. But as I watched Trevor speak, something nagged at me. There was a practiced quality to his words, a sense that he'd given similar speeches before in different contexts. He talked about Sarah the way he might describe a successful business acquisition, with appreciation for her value, but without the vulnerability that real love requires. It was a small thing, probably noticeable only to someone who was looking for flaws, but it lodged in my mind like a splinter. I left the reception early, claiming I had an early morning at the shop. I congratulated the happy couple during the receiving line, shaking Trevor's hand and kissing Sarah's cheek with what I hoped looked like genuine warmth. Sarah held my hand for a moment longer than necessary and whispered that she hoped I'd find happiness too. Her eyes were bright with champagne and joy, and for a second I saw the woman I'd fallen in love with before Trevor's world had changed her. The drive home was quiet and dark, Portland's lights blurring together as I replayed the evening's events. I felt strangely empty, not devastated as I'd expected but simply drained. Watching Sarah marry Trevor had been the final punctuation mark on our relationship, the moment when what we'd had officially became past tense. I could finally stop waiting for her to come back or hoping that things would work out differently. What I didn't know, as I pulled into my apartment's parking lot and prepared to begin the next chapter of my life, was that Trevor and Sarah's perfect marriage was built on foundations that were far less solid than they appeared. I didn't know about the secrets Trevor had been hiding, or the financial house of cards that his success was really built on. I had no idea that within 3 months, everything would start to unravel in ways that would shock everyone who knew them. All I knew that night was that I'd survived watching the woman I loved marry someone else, and that maybe survival was enough for now. I went to bed in my small apartment above the auto shop, listening to the familiar sounds of the city settling into sleep, and tried not to think about Sarah and Trevor beginning their honeymoon in a luxury resort in Bali, a place I'd never be able to afford to visit. But life has a way of delivering justice when you least expect it, and sometimes the people who seem to have everything are the ones with the most to lose. 3 weeks after the wedding, I received a phone call that would change everything I thought I knew about Trevor, about success, and about the price of getting everything you think you want. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning while I was replacing the brake pads on a Honda Accord. My hands were covered in grease and I almost didn't answer when I saw the unfamiliar number, but something made me wipe my hands on my coveralls and pick up. The voice on the other end was nervous, shaky even. "My name is Jennifer Walsh," she said. "I work in accounting at Tech Solutions Northwest. I think we need to talk about your cousin Trevor." I stepped outside the garage bay, away from the noise of pneumatic tools and the radio playing classic rock. Jennifer explained that she'd gotten my number from the employee directory, which listed me as Trevor's emergency contact from years ago when he'd first started the company. She'd been trying to decide for weeks whether to call, but what she'd discovered was keeping her awake at night. We arranged to meet that evening at a small cafe in Beaverton, far enough from downtown Portland that we were unlikely to run into anyone from Trevor's social circle. Jennifer was younger than I'd expected, maybe 25, with brown hair pulled back in a ponytail and the kind of earnest face that belonged to someone who'd never learned to lie convincingly. She clutched a manila folder against her chest like it contained state secrets. She ordered tea and I got coffee, and we sat in a corner booth while she gathered the courage to tell me what she'd found. Jennifer had been working in accounts receivable for Tech Solutions Northwest for 3 years, she explained. She loved her job, believed in the company's mission, and had always admired Trevor's leadership, until she started noticing irregularities in the financial reports. It began small, she said. Invoices that didn't match purchase orders, payments to vendors she'd never heard of, expense reports for business trips that seemed excessive even for a successful tech company. Jennifer was detail-oriented by nature, the kind of person who caught typos that everyone else missed, so these discrepancies nagged at her even when her supervisor told her not to worry about it. The real red flag came when she was reconciling the quarterly reports for the board of directors. Tech Solutions Northwest was supposed to be incredibly profitable, with contracts worth millions of dollars, and a client list that read like a Fortune 500 directory. But when Jennifer dug deeper into the actual numbers, she found something that made her stomach drop. The contracts were real, but the payments weren't coming through. Several major clients were months behind on their invoices, and some hadn't paid anything at all. When Jennifer tried to follow up, she discovered that half the contact information was outdated, and several of the companies claimed they'd never heard of Tech Solutions Northwest. The impressive client list that Trevor showcased at board meetings and investor presentations was largely fictional. Jennifer opened the manila folder and spread documents across the table between us. Bank statements, invoice copies, email printouts, all meticulously organized with colored tabs and handwritten notes in the margins. She'd been documenting everything for months, building a case that she was terrified to present to anyone within the company. The pattern was clear once she laid it out. Trevor had been using new investor money to pay existing obligations, creating the illusion of profitability, while the actual business foundation crumbled beneath him. He'd forge client signatures, backdate contracts, and create elaborate paper trails that looked legitimate to anyone who didn't examine them closely. It was a sophisticated Ponzi scheme disguised as a successful tech company. But the most shocking revelation was still coming. Jennifer pulled out a folder marked personal expenses and handed it to me with shaking hands. Inside were copies of credit card statements, receipts, and wire transfer records. Trevor had been using company funds to finance his lifestyle, routing money through a network of shell companies and dummy accounts to hide the transactions. The wedding alone had cost over $200,000, all of it paid for with money stolen from Tech Solutions Northwest. Sarah's engagement ring, their honeymoon in Bali, the down payment on their new house in the West Hills, it was all purchased with funds that belonged to investors who trusted Trevor with their money. I stared at the documents spread across the table, feeling a mixture of shock and something that might have been vindication. Trevor's perfect life, the success that had made me feel so inadequate, was built entirely on lies and theft. The wealth that had attracted Sarah away from me didn't actually exist. Jennifer explained that she'd tried to bring her concerns to Trevor's business partner David Kellman, but he'd dismissed her worries as the result of inexperience with high-level finance. She'd considered going to the FBI, but she was terrified of losing her job and being blacklisted from the industry. She was also worried about the dozens of employees who would lose their jobs if the company collapsed, good people who had no idea they were working for a criminal enterprise. "That's why she'd called me," she said. She'd heard through office gossip that Trevor had family in Portland, and she'd hoped I might know what to do with the information. She couldn't live with staying silent, but she also couldn't risk destroying her career by going to the authorities without support. I asked Jennifer if she'd made copies of everything, and she nodded, explaining that she'd been storing duplicates in a safety deposit box for months. Smart thinking, I told her. Because what she'd uncovered was going to destroy Trevor's life, and he wasn't going to go down without a fight. We spent 2 more hours going through the documents, with Jennifer explaining the financial details and me asking questions about timelines and evidence. By the time we parted ways, I had a clear picture of the scope of Trevor's fraud and a plan for what to do next. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, processing what Jennifer had told me, and trying to decide how I felt about it. Part of me was angry on behalf of the investors and employees who'd been deceived. Part of me was sad for Sarah, who'd married a man based on a completely false understanding of who he was. But if I'm being honest, part of me was also satisfied in a way that made me uncomfortable with myself. The next morning, I called in sick to work and drove to the Oregon State Bar Association building in Lake Oswego. I needed legal advice from someone who specialized in financial crimes, someone who could help me understand the best way to handle Jennifer's evidence without destroying innocent people's lives in the process. The attorney I met with was named Patricia Helms, a woman in her 50s, who'd built a reputation prosecuting white-collar criminals. She listened to my story without interruption, taking notes on a yellow legal pad and asking occasional clarifying questions. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and whistled softly. "This is substantial," she said. "If your friend's documentation is as thorough as you've described, your cousin is looking at serious federal charges. Wire fraud, securities fraud, money laundering, probably tax evasion as well. He could be facing decades in prison." Patricia explained that the most important thing was to preserve the evidence and protect Jennifer from retaliation. She recommended that Jennifer retain her own attorney before making any formal reports, and that she document any attempts by Trevor or his associates to intimidate or silence her. The conversation turned to my own role in the situation. Patricia asked if I had any financial ties to Tech Solutions Northwest, any investments or business relationships that might complicate my involvement. When I told her I had no connection to the company beyond family ties to Trevor, she suggested I could serve as an intermediary between Jennifer and law enforcement. "You have to understand," she said, "cases like this often take months or even years to develop. Your cousin isn't going to be arrested tomorrow. There will be investigations, forensic accounting, interviews with victims and witnesses. It's a slow process, but if the evidence is solid, justice will eventually prevail." I left Patricia's office with a folder full of business cards and referrals, contact information for FBI agents who specialized in financial crimes and forensic accountants who could help analyze Jennifer's documentation. I also had a timeline for next steps and a better understanding of what Jennifer and I were getting ourselves into. The hardest part was keeping quiet about what I knew. I went back to work the next day and tried to maintain my normal routine, but every conversation felt surreal. When my coworker Danny asked if I'd heard from the newlyweds, I had to resist the urge to tell him that Trevor was a criminal who'd stolen money to pay for his wedding. When my grandmother called to chat about family news, I listened to her praise Trevor's business success while knowing it was all built on fraud. A week after my meeting with Jennifer, I got a text message from Sarah. She and Trevor were back from their honeymoon, and she wanted to thank me for being so gracious at the wedding. She'd been worried about how awkward it might be, but I'd handled everything with such maturity that it had meant a lot to both of them. Reading her message, I felt a complicated mix of emotions. Sarah had no idea she'd married a criminal. Her gratitude for my good behavior at their wedding was based on her belief that Trevor was the successful businessman he pretended to be. In a few months, when the truth came out, her whole world was going to collapse. I started to type a response several times, but each attempt felt wrong. How could I thank her for her kind words while knowing what I knew about her husband? How could I pretend that everything was fine when I was actively working to expose Trevor's crimes? In the end, I sent a simple message saying I was glad they'd had a good honeymoon and that I wished them happiness. Jennifer and I began meeting regularly to plan our approach. She'd retained the attorney Patricia had recommended, a sharp woman named Lisa Chen who specialized in whistleblower protection. Lisa had reviewed Jennifer's evidence and confirmed that it was comprehensive enough to support a federal investigation, but she wanted to gather additional documentation before making any formal reports. The three of us developed a strategy for Jennifer to continue her normal work duties while discreetly collecting more evidence. She would document any new irregularities she discovered, but she wouldn't ask questions that might alert Trevor or his partners to her suspicions. We also established secure communication protocols using encrypted email and burner phones to discuss sensitive information. Meanwhile, I started doing my own research into Trevor's background and business history. I spent evenings at the library using public computers to search through business records, SEC filings, and news archives. What I found was a pattern of questionable deals and failed ventures stretching back to Trevor's early 20s. Before starting Tech Solutions Northwest, Trevor had been involved in 3 other companies that had failed under mysterious circumstances. Each time, he'd attracted investors with impressive presentations and ambitious business plans, but the companies had collapsed when the projected revenues failed to materialize. In each case, Trevor had emerged relatively unscathed while his investors lost everything. The pattern was subtle enough that no single failure looked criminal, but taken together, they suggested someone who was either remarkably unlucky or deliberately deceptive. I printed out everything I could find and added it to the growing file of evidence that Jennifer and I were compiling. 3 weeks into our investigation, Jennifer called me in a panic. Trevor had announced a company-wide meeting for the following Monday, and rumors were circulating that he was planning to announce a major acquisition or merger. Jennifer was terrified that he was preparing to steal even more money, or that he'd somehow discovered her investigation. We arranged an emergency meeting that evening, this time at a diner in Tigard that stayed open late. Jennifer looked exhausted, with dark circles under her eyes, and the jittery demeanor of someone who'd been drinking too much coffee and sleeping too little. She'd been having nightmares about being caught, she told me, dreams where Trevor confronted her in the office and accused her of betrayal. Lisa Chen had advised Jennifer to remain calm and continue her normal routine, but the stress was clearly taking a toll. I suggested she consider taking a few sick days to give herself some breathing room, but Jennifer worried that any change in her behavior might raise suspicions. The company meeting turned out to be exactly what Jennifer had feared. Trevor announced that Tech Solutions Northwest had been acquired by a larger firm based in Seattle, a transaction that would result in significant payouts for all employees and investors. The acquisition was scheduled to close within 60 days, pending final due diligence and regulatory approval. Jennifer knew immediately that the acquisition was fake. She'd seen no evidence of due diligence activities, no visits from potential buyers, no legal paperwork related to a sale. She suspected that Trevor was planning to use the announcement to steal whatever money remained in the company accounts before disappearing. We had to act quickly. Lisa Chen arranged a meeting with FBI agent Robert Martinez, who specialized in financial crimes and had experience with cases similar to Trevor's. Agent Martinez was younger than I'd expected, maybe 40, with the kind of intense focus that made you feel like he was analyzing every word you spoke. The meeting took place in a conference room at the FBI field office in Portland, a sterile environment that made the situation feel suddenly real and serious. Jennifer was nervous but determined, answering Agent Martinez's questions with the precision of someone who'd been preparing for this moment for months. Agent Martinez reviewed Jennifer's documentation with the eye of someone who'd seen similar evidence before. He asked detailed questions about the company's financial structure, Trevor's business relationships, and the timeline of suspicious activities. He was particularly interested in the fake acquisition announcement, which he said could constitute additional charges of securities fraud. The FBI would open a formal investigation, Agent Martinez explained, but Jennifer would need to continue working at Tech Solutions Northwest for a few more weeks to help gather real-time evidence of the planned theft. It would be dangerous, he acknowledged, but it was the best way to build an airtight case against Trevor. Jennifer agreed, despite her obvious fear, because she understood that dozens of innocent people would lose their life savings if Trevor succeeded in his final theft. We established new protocols for her safety, including regular check-ins with Agent Martinez and emergency procedures if she felt threatened. I left the FBI office feeling like I'd crossed a line that I couldn't uncross. I was no longer just someone who'd been hurt by Trevor's actions. I was actively working to destroy him, and that knowledge sat heavily on my conscience even though I knew it was the right thing to do. The next few weeks were tense and surreal. I continued my normal routine, working at the auto shop and maintaining social connections, while secretly coordinating with federal investigators to build a case against my own cousin. Jennifer remained at Tech Solutions Northwest, documenting Trevor's increasingly desperate attempts to liquidate company assets before the fake acquisition deadline. Trevor himself seemed oblivious to the investigation swirling around him. I saw him twice during this period, once at a family barbecue and once at the grocery store, and both times he was his usual confident self. He talked about his excitement for the acquisition, his plans to travel with Sarah once the deal closed, and his gratitude for the financial security the sale would provide. Watching him lie so effortlessly to family members made me understand how he'd been able to deceive investors for so long. Trevor wasn't just comfortable with dishonesty, he seemed to genuinely believe his own fabrications. He spoke about the fake acquisition with the same enthusiasm he'd once shown for legitimate business opportunities. Sarah appeared happy during this time, glowing with the contentment of a new bride, whose future seemed secure. She and Trevor had moved into their new house, a sprawling contemporary home in the West Hills with panoramic views of the city. Sarah posted photos on social media of their home renovations, their dinner parties with influential friends, and their weekend trips to wine country. Looking at those photos, knowing what I knew about how their lifestyle was being financed, I felt sick with the knowledge of how drastically their lives were about to change. Sarah had no idea that her dream house was purchased with stolen money, or that her husband was planning to disappear with whatever assets he could liquidate. The end came faster than anyone expected. On a Thursday morning in November, Agent Martinez called to tell me that Trevor had been arrested at his office while attempting to transfer $2 million to an offshore account. Jennifer's real-time documentation had allowed the FBI to catch him in the act of theft, providing the kind of evidence that would be impossible to dispute in court. The news broke on local television that evening. Tech Solutions Northwest's offices were swarmed with federal agents, employees were sent home pending investigation, and Trevor's mugshot appeared on every news channel in Portland. The story described him as the alleged mastermind of a multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme that had defrauded investors and employees across the Pacific Northwest. I watched the coverage from my apartment, feeling a strange mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Justice was being served, but it was also destroying the lives of people who'd trusted Trevor. His employees would lose their jobs. His investors would lose their money, and Sarah would lose everything she thought she'd gained by marrying him. My phone rang constantly that evening, family members calling to express shock and disbelief about Trevor's arrest. My grandmother cried when she called, unable to understand how her golden grandson could have done such terrible things. My mother wanted to know if I'd seen any signs of trouble, if there was anything I could have done to prevent the situation. I answered their questions as honestly as I could without revealing my role in Trevor's downfall. I expressed appropriate shock and concern, offered to help with whatever the family needed, and deflected questions about whether I'd suspected anything was wrong. It was another layer of deception, but one that seemed necessary to protect Jennifer and preserve my own privacy. The hardest call came 2 days after Trevor's arrest. Sarah's voice was barely recognizable, raw with tears and exhaustion. She asked if we could meet for coffee, said she needed to talk to someone who'd known both her and Trevor before everything fell apart. We met at the same cafe where Jennifer and I had first discussed her discoveries, a choice that felt grimly appropriate. Sarah looked like she'd aged years in the span of days. Her eyes were red from crying, her usually perfect hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and she wore jeans and a sweatshirt instead of her typical polished outfits. Sarah's story poured out in fragments between tears. The FBI had seized their house, their cars, and all their bank accounts. Everything they owned had been purchased with stolen money and was now considered evidence in a federal criminal case. Sarah was staying with her sister in Seattle, trying to figure out how to rebuild a life that had been completely dismantled. She'd had no idea about Trevor's crimes, she insisted. She'd believed his explanations about his business success, trusted his assurances that their lifestyle was sustainable, and never questioned the source of their wealth. The signs had been there, she admitted, but she'd been too blinded by the life he was providing to look closely at how he was providing it. The worst part, Sarah said, wasn't the loss of material possessions. It was the realization that her entire marriage had been based on lies. Trevor had used her as a prop in his elaborate deception, a beautiful wife who legitimized his claims of success and stability. She'd thought he loved her for who she was, but now she understood that he'd loved her for what she represented. I listened to Sarah's pain without revealing what I knew about the investigation or my role in Trevor's arrest. She needed someone to talk to who wasn't connected to the legal proceedings, someone who could simply witness her grief without judgment or agenda. It was the least I could do for the woman I'd once loved. When Sarah asked what she should do next, I suggested she focus on the basics of survival, find a job, secure stable housing, and surround herself with people who cared about her as a person, rather than for what she could provide. I also recommended that she consider therapy to process the trauma of discovering that her marriage had been built on deception. Sarah thanked me for listening, and for not saying "I told you so," even though she was sure I must have suspected something was wrong with Trevor. She apologized again for how she'd ended our relationship, acknowledging that she'd been seduced by a lifestyle that had never been real. I walked Sarah to her car after our conversation, and she hugged me goodbye with the desperate gratitude of someone who'd lost almost everything. Watching her drive away, I felt the complicated emotions of someone who'd gotten exactly the revenge they'd wanted and discovered it tasted nothing like they'd expected. Trevor's trial would take months to complete, but the evidence was overwhelming, and his conviction was essentially guaranteed. He would spend the next 20 years in federal prison, and he would never again have the opportunity to deceive investors or steal money to finance a fraudulent lifestyle. Jennifer received a substantial reward from the SEC for her whistleblowing, enough money to start over in a new city with a new career. She decided to move to Denver and pursue a master's degree in forensic accounting, turning her experience exposing Trevor's crimes into a career, helping other victims of financial fraud. As for me, I went back to my life at the auto shop, but with a new understanding of what really mattered. I'd learned that wealth and success could be fabricated, that the lifestyle I'd envied had been built on lies and theft. I'd also learned that sometimes the people who seem to have everything are the ones with the most to lose. The mechanic's life that had once seemed so small and limiting now felt honest and sustainable. I worked with my hands, earned my money through legitimate labor, and slept peacefully knowing that everything I owned had been acquired through my own efforts. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real in a way that Trevor's empire had never been. Sarah and I didn't stay in touch after our coffee meeting, but I heard through family connections that she'd found work as a dental hygienist in Seattle and was slowly rebuilding her life. She'd filed for divorce while Trevor was awaiting trial, a legal proceeding that was complicated by the fact that all their shared assets had been seized by the federal government. The story of Trevor's downfall became a cautionary tale in Portland's business community, a reminder that success should be measured by more than just material accumulation, Several of his victims started a support group for people who'd been deceived by financial predators, and Jennifer was invited to speak about the warning signs that ordinary people could watch for. Looking back on everything that happened, I realized that my greatest victory wasn't in exposing Trevor's crimes or seeing him face justice for his actions. My greatest victory was in learning to value the authentic life I'd built over the artificial lifestyle I'd once envied. Trevor's downfall had taught me that the appearance of success meant nothing without the substance to support it. The whole experience had changed my perspective on relationships as well. I'd learned that losing Sarah to Trevor's wealth hadn't been a failure on my part, but rather a revelation of her true character. A woman who would leave an honest man for stolen money wasn't someone I wanted to build a life with anyway. 6 months after Trevor's arrest, I ran into Sarah's sister at the grocery store. She told me that Sarah was doing well in Seattle, that she'd started dating a teacher who appreciated her for who she was, rather than what she could provide. She was also volunteering with a legal aid organization that helped victims of financial crimes, using her experience with Trevor to help other people who'd been deceived. Hearing that Sarah had found a way to turn her painful experience into something positive made me genuinely happy for her. She'd learned the same lesson I had about the difference between authentic and artificial success, and she was building a new life based on real values rather than material accumulation. As for Trevor, he pled guilty to multiple federal charges and was sentenced to 25 years in prison. He would be in his late 50s when he was released, assuming he served his full sentence. His conviction made national news as an example of how sophisticated financial fraud had become, and how important whistleblowers were in exposing white-collar crime. The last I heard, Trevor was serving his sentence at a federal prison in Oregon, working in the laundry facility for 30 cents an hour. It was a dramatic fall from the penthouse lifestyle he'd maintained through theft and deception, but it was the natural consequence of the choices he'd made. Sometimes I wonder if things would have been different if I'd confronted Trevor about his relationship with Sarah instead of letting them pursue their affair in secret. Would he have continued his criminal activities if he'd faced real consequences for his personal betrayals? Would the dozens of victims have been spared their losses if I'd been more willing to fight for my relationship? But I've come to understand that Trevor's crimes weren't really about Sarah or their marriage or my inadequate response to their affair. Trevor was a criminal who used charm and deception to take what didn't belong to him, whether that was other people's money or other people's girlfriends. Sarah was just another victim of his manipulative personality, even if she didn't recognize it at the time. The experience taught me that justice sometimes comes in unexpected forms, and that the people who seem to have everything aren't always the ones we should envy. Real success isn't measured by the size of your bank account or the cost of your possessions, but by the authenticity of your relationships and the honesty of your work. I still work at the auto shop, still live in my small apartment, still drive my aging pickup truck. But I sleep peacefully at night knowing that everything I have was earned through honest work, and that my life is built on foundations that can't be seized by federal agents or destroyed by criminal investigations. Trevor's empire crumbled because it was built on lies, but the simple life he'd taught me to despise has endured because it was built on truth. In the end, that difference made all the difference in the world. 2 years passed before I heard from Sarah again. I was closing up the shop on a rainy Thursday evening when she appeared in the doorway, looking different than I remembered. Her hair was shorter, more practical, and she wore simple clothes that seemed chosen for comfort rather than impression. The designer wardrobe and polished appearance were gone, replaced by something more genuine. She asked if we could talk, and I invited her into the small office behind the service bay. Sarah had driven down from Seattle specifically to see me, she said. There were things she needed to say, apologies she needed to make, and truths she needed to share that couldn't be handled over the phone. Trevor had died in prison 6 months earlier, a heart attack, sudden and unexpected for someone only 34 years old. The stress of incarceration, poor prison medical care, and the weight of his crimes had taken their toll faster than anyone anticipated. Sarah had learned about his death from a victim's advocate, who thought she should know, since their divorce had never been finalized due to the complexity of the asset forfeiture case. The news had affected Sarah more than she expected. Not because she still loved Trevor, but because his death felt like the final closing of a chapter that had already caused so much damage. She'd been in therapy for 2 years, working through the trauma of discovering that her marriage was built on lies, and her own role in ignoring warning signs that seemed obvious in retrospect. Sarah told me about her life in Seattle, how she'd started over with nothing but the clothes she was wearing when the FBI seized their house. She'd stayed with her sister for 6 months, working temporary jobs and slowly rebuilding her credit and her sense of self. The dental practice that hired her knew about her situation and had been patient while she got back on her feet. She'd met someone, a high school guidance counselor named David, who coached soccer on weekends and volunteered at a homeless shelter downtown. He drove a 12-year-old Subaru and lived in a modest apartment near the school where he worked. Their relationship was built on shared values rather than shared ambitions, conversations about books and movies rather than status and wealth. What surprised Sarah most about her new relationship was how peaceful it felt. There was no drama, no competition, no pressure to be someone she wasn't. David appreciated her kindness and her work ethic, her sense of humor and her resilience. He didn't need her to be impressive or sophisticated or connected to important people. He just needed her to be herself. Sarah's real reason for visiting was to thank me for how I'd handled our breakup and Trevor's arrest. She'd learned from federal prosecutors that an anonymous tip had triggered the investigation that brought Trevor down, and she suspected I'd been involved somehow. She didn't need confirmation, she said, but she wanted me to know that she was grateful justice had been served. The victims of Trevor's fraud had recovered only about 30% of their losses through asset forfeiture and insurance claims. Retired couples had lost their life savings. Small business owners had lost their companies. Working families had lost their children's college funds. But at least they'd gotten some measure of justice and the knowledge that Trevor couldn't hurt anyone else. Sarah also wanted to apologize for how she'd treated me during our relationship and its aftermath. She'd been seduced by wealth and status, she admitted, but she'd also been running from her own insecurities about not being successful enough or sophisticated enough. Trevor had offered her an escape from those feelings, but the escape had been an illusion that ultimately made everything worse. I listened to Sarah's apologies and reflections with a mixture of sadness and closure. The woman sitting across from me was more mature and self-aware than the person who'd left me for my cousin 3 years earlier. Her experiences with Trevor and its aftermath had taught her valuable lessons about authenticity and the difference between love and manipulation. When Sarah asked about my life, I told her about the small changes I'd made since Trevor's arrest. I'd taken on a business partner at the shop, an experienced mechanic named Rosa who'd helped me expand our services and improve our reputation. We were busier than ever, with a waiting list of customers who appreciated honest work and fair pricing. I'd also started dating again, slowly and carefully. I'd met Elena at a community college where I was taking evening classes in small business management. She was studying to become a veterinary technician, working full-time at an animal shelter while finishing her degree. Elena was practical and funny, completely unimpressed by wealth or status, and she made me laugh in ways I'd forgotten were possible. My relationship with Elena was different from what I'd had with Sarah. It was built on mutual respect and shared values rather than passion and intensity. We enjoyed simple pleasures like hiking and cooking together, reading books and watching old movies. Elena knew about my history with Sarah and Trevor, but she didn't judge me for it or try to compete with memories of my past. Sarah seemed genuinely happy to hear about the positive changes in my life. She said I looked more peaceful than she remembered, more comfortable in my own skin. The bitterness and inadequacy that had marked our final months together were gone, replaced by a quiet confidence that came from knowing who I was and what I valued. We talked for almost 2 hours that evening, covering everything from family news to career plans to lessons learned from our shared experiences with Trevor. It felt like a conversation between old friends rather than former lovers, marked by forgiveness and understanding rather than lingering resentment or regret. When Sarah prepared to leave, she handed me a small wrapped package. Inside was a photo from our trip to Crater Lake, the one where we'd hiked to the rim and spent the afternoon talking about our dreams for the future. She'd kept it through everything that happened afterward, she said, because it reminded her of a time when she'd been genuinely happy rather than just successful. The photo represented something important to both of us, Sarah explained. It was proof that what we'd shared had been real, even if it hadn't been enough to overcome her weaknesses and Trevor's manipulation. She wanted me to have it as a reminder that our relationship had mattered, that the love we'd shared had been authentic, even if it hadn't lasted. I walked Sarah to her car in the parking lot behind the shop. The rain had stopped, and the evening air was clear and cool. She hugged me goodbye, a gesture of friendship and closure rather than romance or regret. She thanked me again for listening and for handling everything with such grace, then drove away into the Seattle traffic. Standing in the empty parking lot, I looked at the photo Sarah had given me. We both looked so young and hopeful, posing against the backdrop of the lake, with our arms around each other and genuine smiles on our faces. It was a reminder of who we'd been before Trevor entered our lives and changed everything, but also a recognition of how much we'd both grown since then. I went back inside the shop and placed the photo on my desk, next to pictures of Elena and me from our recent camping trip to the Oregon coast. The contrast between the two relationships was stark but not painful. Sarah and I had loved each other, but we'd been fundamentally incompatible in ways that Trevor's wealth had merely exposed rather than created. Elena and I were building something more sustainable, based on shared values and realistic expectations rather than passion and dreams of transformation. The experience with Trevor had taught me valuable lessons about the nature of success and the importance of authenticity. Real wealth wasn't measured by bank account balances or luxury possessions, but by the quality of relationships and the satisfaction of honest work. Real love wasn't about transformation or escape, but about acceptance and mutual support. Trevor's crimes had destroyed dozens of lives and caused immeasurable pain for his victims and their families. But his downfall had also revealed important truths about the difference between appearance and reality, between authentic success and elaborate deception. The investigation that brought him down had been a form of justice not just for his financial victims but for everyone who'd been deceived by his carefully constructed facade. In the months that followed Sarah's visit, I found myself thinking less about the past and more about the future. Elena and I moved in together, combining our modest resources to rent a small house near the shop. We adopted a rescue dog, planted a vegetable garden, and started talking about long-term plans that felt achievable and authentic. My business continued to grow, built on reputation and referrals rather than marketing or ambition. Customers appreciated the honest prices and quality work, and many became friends as well as clients. I was earning enough to live comfortably without the stress of constant growth or the pressure to impress others with material success. The auto shop had become more than just a business, it was a gathering place for people who valued practical skills and honest work. Rosa and I employed 2 additional mechanics, both young people who were learning the trade while earning decent wages. We offered apprenticeships to high school students and donated our services to single mothers and elderly residents who couldn't afford expensive repairs. Family gatherings were different now, marked by Trevor's absence and the knowledge of what he'd done. My grandmother had never fully recovered from the shock of learning about his crimes, but she'd found peace in understanding that his actions reflected his own choices rather than any failure on her part or the family's part to guide him properly. The rest of the family had rallied around the victims of Trevor's fraud, contributing to legal funds and offering emotional support where possible. We'd learned that being related to someone didn't make you responsible for their crimes, but it did create an obligation to help clean up the damage they'd caused. 3 years after Trevor's death, I married Elena in a small ceremony at the Botanical Gardens in Portland. Sarah sent a card congratulating us, along with a note saying she was engaged to David and planning a simple wedding in Seattle. Her message was warm and genuine, expressing happiness for both of us and gratitude for the way our story had ultimately ended. The wedding was everything Elena and I wanted: small, meaningful, and focused on the people we loved rather than the impression we were making. My grandmother served as my best woman, and Rosa handled the photography with a borrowed camera. We spent our honeymoon camping in the Cascade Mountains, hiking trails and sleeping under stars that cost nothing to enjoy but were more beautiful than any luxury resort. Standing at the altar with Elena, I thought about the journey that had brought me to that moment. Losing Sarah to Trevor had felt like the end of the world at the time, but it had actually been the beginning of a better life built on more solid foundations. Trevor's betrayal had revealed truths about success and authenticity that I might never have learned otherwise. The mechanic's life that had once seemed inadequate compared to Trevor's wealth now felt like the ultimate victory. I'd built something real and sustainable, something that couldn't be seized by federal agents or destroyed by criminal investigations. My relationships were based on truth rather than deception, my success was measured by satisfaction rather than accumulation, and my future was secure because it was built on foundations that would endure. Looking back on everything that happened, I realized that Trevor's greatest crime wasn't stealing money from investors or lying to federal agents. His greatest crime was teaching people to value appearance over reality, to measure success by material accumulation rather than personal fulfillment. He'd corrupted not just financial systems but value systems, convincing people that worth could be purchased and happiness could be acquired. But his downfall had also taught important lessons about the power of truth and the importance of justice. Jennifer's courage in exposing his crimes had protected countless future victims and demonstrated that ordinary people could stand up to sophisticated fraudsters. The FBI's thorough investigation had shown that white-collar criminals weren't above the law, regardless of their wealth or social connections. Most importantly, the whole experience had taught me that the best revenge against people who try to make you feel inadequate is to build a life so authentic and fulfilling that their deception becomes irrelevant. Trevor had tried to prove that money could buy everything that mattered, but his empire had crumbled while my simple life had endured and flourished. Elena and I now run the auto shop together, combining mechanical expertise with business acumen to serve our community's transportation needs. We employ 8 people, offer competitive wages and benefits, and take pride in solving problems that other shops can't handle. Our success is measured not by profit margins but by customer satisfaction and employee happiness. The shop has become a symbol of the values Trevor had tried to destroy: honest work, fair dealing, and authentic relationships. Customers know they'll receive quality service at reasonable prices, employees know they'll be treated with respect and paid fairly, and the community knows we'll be here when they need us. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Sarah had never met Trevor, if our relationship had continued without the intervention of his wealth and deception. But I've come to understand that those questions are pointless. The experience with Trevor revealed who Sarah really was and who I really was, information that was valuable regardless of how painful it was to learn. Sarah found her authentic self through the trauma of discovering Trevor's lies and rebuilding her life from nothing. I found my authentic self by learning to value what I'd built rather than envying what others appeared to have. Trevor's crimes had caused enormous pain, but they'd also created opportunities for growth and self-discovery that might not have existed otherwise. The auto shop closes at 6 every evening, and Elena and I walk home together through the neighborhood we've come to love. We cook dinner together, tend our garden, and spend evenings reading or planning weekend adventures that cost more in time than money. It's a simple life, but it's completely genuine in ways that Trevor's elaborate facade never was. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.